I would like to welcome you to another event in our Krasno event series here at UNC Chapel Hill. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Swain. I'm Klaus Laris. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Swain tonight. I would also like to remind you to fill in our mailing list and to check out our YouTube channel. You know, we videotape all of our events, and they are really good watching, brilliant watching, so please repeatedly look at our YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to the channel for free, and then you automatically get notification when we have uploaded a new event. There's also our website, and of course, if you have forgotten when the next event is, you can always check the website. That's krasnoevents.com. Michael Swain and I met a few months ago in Beijing when we both attended the World Peace Forum, and that was an interesting semi-academic, semi-political conference, and I attended Michael's talk, and I was so impressed by his talk that I thought I have to invite him to come to us and talk to us. And luckily, he had time to do so, and here he is tonight. Michael is one of America's most prominent China analysts, and he focuses particularly on Chinese security and defense policy. He is at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. He has been there, as he told me, over lunch for the last 18 years, so for quite some time. And during that time, he has really developed a reputation of being one of the most insightful analysts of what is going on in China. So he looks at China and Asian defense and security policy. He also looks at U.S. China relations. And he looks really at the entire region so that you can put China into context. Previously, before working at the Carnegie Endowment, he worked at the RAND Corporation. He did his PhD at Harvard University, and sometimes he also advises the U.S. government. And we, of course, would like to know tonight what sort of advice he actually gives to the American government officials and politicians in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Swain tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me? Pretty good? I'm kind of tall, so I'm sort of a long way away from the microphone.
You can also take it out if you like.
All right. Well, we'll see. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'd like to talk with you about what I regard as the somewhat hostile and confrontational view that is now holding sway in Washington up toward China, along with Russia and Iran. You've probably heard China, Russia, and Iran are put together in the same group. This viewpoint is very evident both in the Trump administration and in the Congress, and among many foreign policy pundits in Washington and elsewhere, although it is not 100% endorsed and supported across Washington and elsewhere, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So what I'd like to do is explain what this view in Washington is and why I think it's really unrealistic and largely counterproductive for U.S. interests. And then I'll say something about what I think alternative approaches toward China, at least, should be, and what would better serve U.S. interests as we move forward with China. I should say, as Klaus suggested, I'm not a diplomat, nor a former U.S. government official. I am a policy analyst who has never served in the government, although I have maintained close ties with it over the years, especially with the defense sector, which began when I was at the RAND Corporation. And I've been observing China for at least 30 years and probably longer. I first came into contact with China when I went to high school in Hong Kong. And I arrived there in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, which some of you may know was a cataclysmic event in China in the late 1960s and early 70s. And that gave me the China bug, watching that event unfold in Hong Kong, which at that time, of course, was a British colony. So I'm going to be rather blunt and perhaps diplomatic in some of my comments, but as I say, since I'm not part of the U.S. government, I can say what I like. Listening to the Trump administration, the key geostrategic issue that faces the world today sounds very simple and straightforward. It consists of a growing contest of largely existential proportions between three major revisionist powers, China, Russia, and Iran, on one hand, and the West and the United States on the other. Now, the former three states allegedly seek to replace the long-standing post-World War II-led liberal international order, as it's called, which is defined as marked by notions of democracy, free trade, and international law. These countries are supposedly seeking to replace this order with a hostile, undemocratic, mercantilistic, and law and norm violating order that seeks to displace the West and subjugate others and dominate the world, eventually. Now, this is a nice, neat, black and white, sort of Manichaean challenge, easy to understand, untrammeled by confusing details. To cope with this situation, the Trump administration proposes an equally nice, neat, and straightforward solution. That's a reinvigorated America that is secure at home from all manner of threats, domestic and foreign, and strong abroad. And it's to do this through a decisive leadership, focusing on countering all those who would threaten the liberal order and or use it to cheat or hoodwink or otherwise weaken the United States. And to make America strong and secure, the Trump administration and Trump's supporters propose several things. They propose what I regard as a largely punitive, rather my way or the highway, bilateral negotiating approach to most interstate economic disputes, relying on what I regard as suspect national security justifications for what are non-World Trade Organization compliant tariffs and other punitive actions. It relies on what I believe are largely feckless attempts to increase U.S. defense spending to excessive levels. And it relies a lot on what I and others would regard as rather hair-raising speeches and strategy statements about the threats posed to American society by undemocratic nations such as China, apparently designed in part to scare the public into accepting the costs of this policy, including more defense spending. And then in Asia, it presents what's called a free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which is largely centered on a putative alliance of democratic countries in Asia, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, but is focused primarily on countering China. And yet, despite all of this, the Trump administration would have you believe that all they really want from China, and to some extent Russia, is fairness, reciprocity, and respect for international law. Now, interestingly enough, most recently, Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo have repeated these negative assessments about China, Russia, and Iran, but they've also caveated them recently. If you read their most recent speeches, caveating what had been the usual zero-sum approach to understanding Beijing. In fact, they asserted in similar speeches that the United States does not seek confrontation with China. It's not seeking to decouple China from the United States. It's not seeking to contain China's development. And in fact, they uttered the dreaded word engagement, that the United States needs to continue engaging with China as part of its central policy. Even more positively, they said that the U.S. will continue to forge strong bonds with China through education, travel, cultural exchange, etc. that the U.S. wants a constructive relationship with China's leaders. It wants to see a prosperous China at peace with its own people and its neighbors, and it wants to see a thriving China, a liberalized China, and a China that respects basic human rights. All sounds very good. Even Secretary Pompeo even said that President Trump's view of the China, that he basically supported President Trump's view that China has a right to its own system, stating every nation is sovereign, they get to lead their nation in the way they want, we respect Chinese sovereignty, they have a right to lead it. This is kind of perplexing. There's really a contradictory element here. These views are jarringly in contrast with the above outlined views I just described of China, presented in Trump administration documents and statements made prior to these two speeches. Indeed, the still upheld notion of a zero-sum strategic competition between a free versus revisionist order would logically suggest a decisive weakening of the Chinese government, and ideally its replacement by one more compliant with the interests of the United States. This is certainly the clear implications of two critical strategy documents that the United States published at the end of 2017 and early 2018. And I'm referring to the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy, which laid out the elements of this revisionist contest between this revisionist order and the U.S. and the threats that the United States, that China and Russia and Iran pose. So what explains this more recent caveat that we've seen in the speeches of Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo? Although I don't know for sure, my guess is that they reflect two basic factors. First, the administration is trying to assuage the many concerns regarding its zero-sum approach to China that have emerged over the past 2 years among U.S. friends and allies, and within both U.S. policy circles and the U.S. public. In a recent poll, nearly 70% of Americans stated that they want the U.S. to have a friendly, cooperative relationship with China, even though many are more concerned today about the potential threat posed by China, at least in the economic sphere. And in July of this year, an open letter critical of this zero-sum viewpoint appeared in Washington in the Washington Post and has now been signed by nearly 200 China and Asia experts, foreign policy practitioners, business people, and others. And I was directly involved in that effort. In addition, U.S. friends and allies such as Singaporeans, South Koreans, Europeans, and others have publicly expressed similar concerns about the zero-sum nature of the U.S. approach to dealing with China. So that is one reason I think that this caveat has occurred. Another reason is because, in fact, the administration doesn't have a coherent, coordinated China or Asia strategy and set of policies. It's defined its approach to China largely in terms, I would argue, of tougher attitudes, tougher postures, and some threats, as in the form of tariffs, all put under a general rubric of what's called pushback, and a desire to be something other than the Obama policies of engagement. Now, this has largely amounted thus far to efforts to bludgeon China through tariffs, to submit to a constantly changing set of economic demands, usually punctuated or altered by presidential tweets. It's characterized by the enunciation of what I said earlier, the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, that is either directed at China, as I suggested, or more recently, to be inclusive of China, as actually some officials have recently said, depending upon who you speak to. It's either designed to confront China or designed to eventually include China. And I should say that a recent report by the State Department on this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy suggested that the former, that is to say, to oppose China, is more likely, because that's the thrust of that report by and large. U.S. administration efforts have also consisted of what I would call rather crude efforts to dissuade friends and allies from supporting Chinese development initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's called, or to accept Chinese loans. And then finally, administration efforts consist of attempts to counter all manner of real and imagined Chinese influence efforts in American society, involving the closing of what's called Confucius Institutes at various universities, and in some cases, the intimidation of Chinese scholars and researchers. Now, in this context of these actions, the recent caveats about the desire for a productive, positive-sum relationship with China seem more like rather defensive public relations gestures than a new element of the existing strategy. But we will see. It's still early going, and perhaps the administration does have ideas to modify its position. In any event, when you look aside from all of these and you try to look at what I would call reality, you see a somewhat different picture. But nonetheless, that different picture is somewhat confusing because in reality, some of the elements of the Trump administration's criticisms of China are certainly true. China's rise is indeed, in some ways, not all, challenging old power structures, old assumptions about the requirements for order and prosperity, and some old norms and principles. Although, unlike what some people might think, there is virtually no evidence that Beijing believes that its goals of national rejuvenation and great power status require the upending of the global order and Chinese dominion over Asia, China does in fact seek to reduce its vulnerability to various security threats, including ones that it would believe are posed by the U.S. in Asia, to increase its level of economic security and its political influence, given its growing reliance on a globalized economic order that is still in many ways dominated by the West, its efforts to increase domestic order through ill-considered rejuvenations of party and ideological controls under the president of China, Xi Jinping. And then it's striving to avoid what's called the middle income trap by becoming a first-rate innovative economy through all means, both fair and foul. China is doing all these things. Now, these goals, in my view, do not constitute efforts to overthrow the global order per se, from which China has profited immensely over the last 30 to 40 years. Nor, I should say, does it require replacing the United States as the dominant global power, which we have enjoyed for 70 years. Neither objective, I would say, is necessary for China's security and prosperity. And neither objective, I don't think, could actually be attained in anything like a cost-effective manner for the Chinese. So, China's views, in many ways, are complex. They're mixed. They have a variety of different objectives. But they are certainly more assertive. And in some ways, I would say, more arrogant on some issues. As I say, greater domestic controls, greater efforts to assert their sovereignty claims in their neighborhood in the maritime area, greater efforts to reduce America's military freedom of action along its maritime periphery, which the United States has basically enjoyed for many decades. And as I say, efforts to use somewhat underhanded methods at times to obtain advanced technologies and capital. This is certainly troubling and challenging for the United States. But it's not terribly surprising, nor does it necessarily close China off to productive efforts at negotiating differences with it. Despite its successes, China is still in many ways a developing country and a relative newcomer to the global order. It comes, after all, from a recent history marked by great domestic disarray, extending well into the 19th century, high levels of corruption and cheating, a hefty dose of resentment towards and admiration for foreigners, and especially Americans, and huge amounts of national pride, both culturally and as a result of its enormous developmental strides, pulling roughly 800 million people out of poverty in 30 years. Now, this complex mix of perceptions and motives, along with the clear fact that China's growth has in many ways benefited other nations. The World Bank estimates that since the global financial crisis of 2008, China has contributed 1/3 to global growth. 1/3. So, I'm not citing all these facts and perceptions to excuse Beijing's misdeeds, but simply to show that China is not subject to the nice, neat labeling of the Trump administration, and that it's decidedly on a learning curve within the global order. In some ways, it's inexperienced as a global power, as a modern global power, and it's immature in some ways in dealing with other powers. And it certainly is overly paranoid, in large part because of its history, but also because of some of the beliefs that are held by the leadership of China and their history as communist figures. But China is learning, I think, learning from others as much or as more than it's trying to influence others. And a sophisticated mix of positive and negative incentives can influence its views much more than by the current demonization effort, which still, I think, is predominant in Washington. Now, I was going to say some words about Russia, but I think I'm going to skip over that because I don't want to take too much time. When we step back from all of what I've just said, we can see that the primary strategic challenges presented by the U.S. China relationship, and Russia is involved in this as well. We could talk about this in Q&A if you'd like. They're twofold. First, a polarization of global politics and power perceptions that undermines the ability and the willingness of the U.S. and China and other states from cooperating in handling common and growing global challenges, from climate change to the global economic and financial order, nuclear stability and proliferation, and major hotspots like Korea. We simply have no alternative but to work with countries like China and to some extent, although a lesser extent, Russia, in dealing with some of these problems. They are global problems, they are common problems, and they can't be handled in a unilateral or bilateral manner. And simple, distorting slogans such as revisionist versus free world orders, or the search for win-win outcomes, which is what China says unendingly, they simply further the suspicion and the polarization process. Now, a second challenge is an accompanying increase, in addition to the polarization risk, the accompanying increase in the likelihood of political military crises in those regions where the U.S. and China most bump up against each other. And you could include Russia, and if you include Russia, we're talking about two regions, basically the Balkans and Central Europe, and East Asia. Now, the latter area, which is what I'm more familiar with, I'll speak about. Here, what we've seen as China has risen and its influence economically and militarily has grown is the evolution of what had been a U.S.-Japan-centric structure in maritime Asia to what is now increasingly becoming an unstable balance. Because China is achieving basically parity with the United States, both in economic and in military terms, in Asia. The dangers of this are made even more serious by the fact that the U.S. and China have yet to really reach greater understandings over those issues in Asia that could in fact trigger confrontation. And that is everything from Korea to Taiwan to territorial claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Indeed, in the absence of an effort to try to moderate what is becoming a potentially ugly dynamic between the U.S. and China in confronting one another on these issues, the chances of a crisis of sorts, albeit likely inadvertent, in Asia are growing. Now, this could take many forms. Beijing could decide that what it regards as aggressive U.S. containment and pushback efforts justly justify unprecedented displays of Chinese determination, in the form, for example, of the permanent deployment of significant military forces on its artificial islands that it has created in the South China Sea, or the declaration of a corresponding air defense identification zone in that area, or worse yet, an exclusion zone for foreign warships, i.e. U.S. warships. Now, for its part, Washington could decide under this kind of a worsening situation that it needs to augment radically its deterrence capabilities regarding Taiwan by allowing U.S. warships to visit that island repeatedly over time. Worse, if U.S.-China relations continue to deteriorate, the U.S. could take steps to block improvements in cross-strait, that is, China-Taiwan relations, so as to ensure that a now strategically valuable Taiwan remains separate from mainland China. This reconceptualization of Taiwan as a strategic asset to be kept from China would amount to a direct violation of and ending of what has been called the One China policy that the United States has held to now since the 1970s, and which has basically kept relations between the U.S. and China reasonably stable since that time. Now, some people think, given China's worsening behavior in some areas and its continued rise in capabilities, that the United States, in fact, should challenge this Taiwan issue, this Taiwan policy, and push the Chinese more, because ultimately it will clarify the situation and the Chinese will back down. And if we don't do it sooner, we shouldn't wait until later, because the Chinese will simply be more capable. Now, I think this kind of an approach is extremely dangerous. It would more likely present and precipitate a crisis with the Chinese that would be very difficult to de-escalate, if indeed it was based upon an American commitment that the One China policy was irrelevant, obsolete. I think that resulting environment would be far more destructive, and it would precipitate developments which could very much move towards what you would see as a new version of a kind of Cold War in Asia, if not conflict. Now, the huge potential risks and dangers of such a position, I think, are compounded by the fact that today the United States, unlike during the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, is, in my view, more insecure, less confident, more internally divided, and more dependent on the world than it was during the height of the Cold War. As a result of this, in a new kind of Cold War, a stronger China would be more likely to overestimate its ability to outmaneuver and pressure the United States, and by the same token, a more insecure yet still very strong Washington could prove more susceptible to overreaction to China's behavior than it was during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, in part to disabuse other countries of the notion that the United States' credibility and strength had in any way deteriorated. So taken together, I think these factors indicate that efforts by either or both sides to isolate or undermine the other in the spirit of the Cold War of the 50s and 60s will produce nothing but dangers. And P.S., very few other capitals would sign on to this. Many of them are committed to growing ties with China, and they also want to preserve their alliance and good political relationships with the United States. Okay, now what is the path back to some level of reality after I've depressed the hell out of all of you? I don't want to be unduly pessimistic. The U.S., but make no mistake, the U.S. relationship with China will be more contentious and more competitive than it has been, at least in any time in recent history. And I'd say that regardless of who leads the country. Both Democrats and Republicans are committed to a much more, I guess confrontational is one word, pushback approach to dealing with China. But more intensely competitive interactions with China don't necessarily mean sharp, confrontational, zero-sum relations of the kind that statements apparently seem to suggest. There's an alternative, which would amount to really an effort to try to develop a bilateral relationship that more realistically addresses the genuine, as opposed to the imaginary or exaggerated concerns of the other side, while recognizing the many very real common reasons to cooperate effectively where needed. There, in other words, is a middle path that can avoid both the self-destructive worst-case assumptions on the one hand and the unrealistic belief that the relationship can somehow return to a more easily managed, cooperative relationship with some competition of the past. I think this commonsensical path has to begin with a recognition of the possibility that Sino-U.S. relations could become more crisis-prone, and therefore should be marked by a more practical, more intensive effort at crisis management and crisis avoidance. Right now, U.S. China crisis management or avoidance is basically focused on military to military, operator based, ship to ship, sea to sea, air to air types of incidents. But I think we need to go much further than this. And if we did, I think we could provide a basis for somewhat more trust. But I think in addition to this, the United States needs to push for a revision of the World Trade Organization in the economic area to more explicitly cover technology and investment areas, which it does not adequately do so, and to accelerate the dispute resolution process. It needs to push for a bilateral investment treaty with China that was inches away from being completed during the Obama administration, I'm told. I think technology decoupling, which is what people talk about today between the U.S. and China, would be both mutually damaging and virtually impossible to sustain. I think the U.S. needs to increase its capacity to compete economically, especially in Asia. And for this, I think it needs to revisit the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but not just accept it wholesale as is, but be part of the effort of trying to revise and adjust it so that it addresses some of the concerns of workers in the U.S. and other countries. And I think the U.S. needs to join, not oppose, as it is currently doing, the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, and influence it from within, which is exactly what happened with another Chinese established institution called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Many people said that this would become a way for China to dominate lending in Asia. It didn't turn out that way. Turned out that the Chinese had to bring on a more international advisory group, and by doing that, it became more international standards in that bank. And I think the same process should be pursued for the Belt and Road. I think the U.S. also needs to work, and I haven't really mentioned this, to reduce the animosity between its two most critical allies in Asia, South Korea and Japan, who right now are probably in about the worst relationship politically that they've been in the post-war period. That doesn't serve U.S. interests. And I would argue it doesn't serve Chinese interests either. For China, I think they need to support meaningful crisis avoidance and crisis management actions that goes well beyond these operator level military to military. They need to make the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, more transparent and more inclusive. with a genuine stress on correcting its deficiencies. They need to make it abundantly clear that their search for more advanced technologies is not to dominate high tech, but it's to be among the best, not the best. And it can do this by showing a willingness to share certain areas of technology and being more open to cooperative new ventures in certain non-sensitive areas. And it needs to make an unqualified commitment not to employ force in the South China Sea to dislodge other claimants from disputed areas or to establish no-go zones in those areas. And the United States, for its part, needs to be willing to moderate its own presence there, including what's called freedom of navigation operations, to establish this kind of understanding with the Chinese. And over the longer term, I think both China and the U.S. need to have a discussion about what constitutes a stable balance in Asia. This is not being done, not even close. But I think there needs to be a discussion of this from a larger strategic perspective. Now, a mutually beneficial Sino-U.S. relationship that is also more competitive won't emerge overnight. It can only take place if leaders understand the stakes involved and the dangers of the corrosive status quo that is existing today. This could require new leadership, both in the U.S. and in China. But the continuation of more narrow, chauvinistic viewpoints, protectionism, etc., will impoverish all who utilize it in an unavoidably globalized world. And great power spheres of influence and notions of domination or hegemonic stability, as it's called, with one nation creating order in the system, I think will need to give way to more deliberate balances, along with regional and global arrangements that more accurately reflect the complexity of the international integrated economy that we look at, especially in the area of technology development. As I say, the result won't be a return to the past model of relations, but rather a set of interactions that is more competitive, more equally balanced, and yet in some ways more cooperative and mutually beneficial than we have at present. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.
That wasn't too far.
No, that was very much on time, and thanks very much for your insights. If you would take a seat over there. I think we very much enjoyed your balanced view, who's trying to be critical of China, critical of Trump, and find your own way forward, perhaps. You talked to us about a new sort of great power arrangement, but I didn't quite understand what new power arrangement you have in mind. Anything which has been attempted in the past, or do you have something more creative, more originally new in mind?
Well, the first thing I'm advocating is a ratcheting down of the zero-sum rhetoric and the argumentation that is going on in all capitals. Because this notion that the world is now defined by a revision, by a great power strategic competition. That's the watchword now. The world is now characterized by great power strategic competition, which is basically harkening back to the 19th century and the early 20th century. But we live today in a globalized world in many ways, as we all know. And we live in a nuclear world with all the major powers that we would think of that would be critically involved have nuclear weapons. India, Russia, the United States, China. And we have to have a way of interacting with each other that involves a more deliberate effort to try to restrain the worst case and restrain what's called a security dilemma. As China rises and gets more capable, it seeks to defend itself more effectively. And in the process of doing that, it alarms other countries. So it has to balance between reassuring other countries and still deterring other countries. Now that's true for all nations. So the way to try to deal with that in Asia, in my view, is to, first of all, recognize that the United States is not going to continue to be the dominant power in that region. China is rising, and China will, as I say, become at least at parity with the United States in that area. And I'm talking about the U.S. and its allies. So I think that what needs to happen is not a grand bargain in the context or in the type of relations of the 19th century where they all sit around a table and carve up the region. But it has to come from a series of initiatives on all the critical hot points in their area that try to stabilize the movement towards militarization that is going on, both in terms of deployments and in terms of activities. That's one thing. I think there has to be a transition to a more defensive-oriented force structure. Now, this gets into the weeds of talking about defense postures, but the United States is a global military power. It has as its doctrine a very offensive-oriented, war-winning strategy. Now, everybody can say, what's wrong with winning wars? But there's another way in which you can actually preserve your security interests, and that is by adopting more defensive-oriented postures that are less oriented towards early and preemptive military action and deep strike action, for example, as we've seen in wars in Iraq and places like that, that is more calibrated and more defensive. The Chinese, of course, would have to adopt something similar to this, and they're doing versions of that right now, although they are now moving into what's called the far seas with their capabilities, but that's the second thing that needs to happen. The first is dealing with the hotspots. The second is a force posture that's more defensive oriented. The third is getting to a more integrated regional economic system in Asia. Right now, we're moving in the opposite direction. By we, I mean the United States. It has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It has adopted a bilateral negotiating strategy with both China and our allies that involves the application of tariffs to tell these other powers that they have to do certain things to balance the trade between the U.S. and these powers. And a balanced trade is not the primary objective that the United States should be looking for. It should be looking for a mutually productive economic relationship that increases incentives across the region to have more open economic systems. And you can't do that on a unilateral or simply bilateral basis. So you have to have, ultimately, the expansion of the TPP and another system that's called the Regional Cooperative Economic Initiative into a region-wide free trade area of sorts that includes both the Chinese and the United States. Only under that basis will you establish the kind of resiliency that you could then use to establish stability in the hotspot areas and in the military posture areas.
Thank you. So,
I've written a big report about this if anybody's interested. It's called Creating a Stable Asia, and you can find it on the Carnegie Endowment website if you're interested in plowing through it.
for free.
You know, I don't know.
I hope so.
Well, if you can't and you want it, let me know. I can send you a copy.
Good. So China doesn't want to take over the world, doesn't want to become the global hegemon, according to you, though some people have suggested that China does want to take over the world. If it doesn't, do we know what China wants? What are China's goals, maybe the minimal and the maximum goals it thinks it can achieve?
This question is constantly debated in Washington. And as Klaus says, there are many people who will say very directly, it's obvious China's objective is to push the United States out of Asia and dominate the world. And then when you say, what exactly do you see as evidence for these kinds of very ambitious objectives? And you get things like, well, they're building artificial islands in the South China Sea. Well, they're challenging the Japanese over the Senkaku Islands. They're building a military that has a blue water force as opposed to a brown water force. These things are all true. But these things also don't constitute what I would regard as anything like clear evidence that the China strategic objective that it regards as necessary is to have this dominant position. Now, what is its policy? What are its policies? I think China is, as I said in my remarks, China in many ways is feeling its way. It wants to be a great power, and in some ways it already is. It wants to be respected by other countries, and it wants to ensure that its claims to certain territorial areas are not rejected or changed or upended. China's legitimacy of the Chinese government and its success and its continued stability is based upon two things. It's based upon its ability to deliver economic growth for China's people, which has been, as I've said, unbelievable for the last 30 years, although it's now slowing in terms of its growth rate. And secondly, it has to be seen to be defending Chinese national interests. And whether for good or for ill, China's modern history has given it an acute sensitivity to territorial sovereignty questions because it has been preyed upon for long periods of time by foreign countries. So these two elements are very critical to Chinese objectives internationally. You have to ask the question then, what do these two things require? Oh, I should say the third thing, which is related to nationalism, is really status. The United States and China have a lot of features in common. We're both rather arrogant countries. We both think we have certain truths by which we live, or we have certain national histories that represent us in the world as being powerful, great powers. We have our history of the revolution, our experience with the U.S. Constitution. I don't have to tell you all this. The Chinese have their own experiences. And they can be pretty smug about it. And so those things have to also, I think, be brought into consideration. And it's funny, I did a book several years ago about U.S. policy toward China, and I asked 50 American policymakers, what works with the Chinese when you talk to them? And they said, almost without exception, first of all, you have to understand what their interests are. And as I just defined them, is basically what they said with their interests. Secondly, you have to understand, though, that their interests aren't always in every single case known, even to themselves. So you can actually influence how they see their own interests in dealing with you. Because a lot of these issues are new to the Chinese. And you can influence, the Chinese, by the way, look up to the United States in many, many ways as an enormously successful country that has enormous power and influence. And they tend to revere American methods in many ways, despite the fact that they're ruled by a communist party that has a history of adversarial relations with a country like the United States. So you got this reaction, and so they think that they can be dealt with if you understand what their interests are, and you can also get them to understand their own interests in some ways. And then thirdly, the Chinese will often trade status for substance in negotiations. Oftentimes you would get a Chinese delegation come to the United States, and this used to happen with senior Chinese military leaders, and they would come and they'd talk to their counterparts in the United States. What would they be most concerned about? They want to know what kind of hotel room they're going to have. They want to know if there's going to be a view of the Capitol. They want to know if they're going to have certain types of, basically, protocol that shows respect for them. And so these kinds of things can be very tangible for the Chinese. Americans tend to be very practical and say, well, that stuff doesn't really matter. What's the substance? But for the Chinese, it matters. So you have to have a sensitivity as to how those things work.
It sounds as if negotiating with the Chinese was rather easy, but I'm not sure it is. Okay, thank you very much. Tell us about Xi Jinping. A long-time leader in China since 2012, 2013. Some people claim he's a new dictator. He wants to be the new Mao Zedong. Some people say he's about to fall from power. he will not survive very much longer. And of course, a lot of people also have their doubts how coherent and how united the Chinese leadership actually is. Can you shed some light on all this?
You pick these easy questions.
Absolutely.
That's another issue that's debated quite a bit. There tends to be a viewpoint right now that Xi Jinping is kind of the new Mao, right? If you read about this at all, Xi Jinping, the president. People say this because he has indeed enhanced the role of the leader, the single leader in China, in a way that harkens back to the Mao Zedong period. Because he uses his image and he uses his thought, his you can't really call it ideology, but his views on different issues as being a very central part of what is the viewpoint of the Chinese government. And, P.S., he had the 2-term limitations serving as president of China removed in the recent government meetings about, this is the presidency of China, this is not the head of the party, but the presidency of China. And so people conclude from all of this that he is virtually omnipotent. He's also the son of a very prominent Chinese official from the past. He's Xi Jinping's what's called a princeling. That is to say, he's one of the children of the elite in China. So he has a certain viewpoint that, and he also has a lot of self-confidence, but he doesn't have a lot of experience with the West. He lived in Iowa for 1 week on a overseas exchange program when he was young. But he has not had a lot of experience with the outside, and he hasn't had a lot of experience in technical ways in governing. So he has harkened back to some old methods and ways. Now, Klaus says, is he strong? What is his image? I think right now he is still in a very strong position in China. He tends to be quite popular because he has led a very big anti-corruption campaign. I mentioned earlier about China's history of corruption and cheating and such. Well, this has gotten much worse under the reforms in China since the 1980s, early 1980s. And Xi Jinping's gone after it, and they've sacked tons and tons of people. Now, if you're a cynical type, you'll say, oh, most of that was to remove his political opponents. That was certainly there, but it was more than that. It was also to try and change the system. And so as a result of that, he's quite popular in many areas in China. But at the same time, his emphasis on greater party control, greater ideology, his own personal stature, and his emphasis on the reintroduction of state enterprises to some degree, these things are grating against a lot of intellectuals in China who don't think that these elements of China are really correct and that China should not be moving in that direction, that efforts to control thought and ideology, etc., really are not going to be conducive to China's modern, technological, innovative society in the 21st century, and I tend to agree with that. I think that Xi Jinping is pushing that control too far, but all a long way of saying, there are two arguments about who Xi Jinping is today. One of them is, he is in fact a Leninist, he is in fact a party leader, he is in fact somebody who believes in party control, and he thinks that China needs to be controlled very firmly, ideologically, and he's not sympathetic to reform, economic reform, continued marketization, opening up, etc. So he's going to want us to have a more traditional approach, which is going to be defeating all that. The contrary argument is, Xi Jinping is very aware of what China needs to do. China cannot retreat from the international system. But in order to do this, China has to stabilize, be more stabilized domestically. And the reforms created enormous corruption and instability. His way of doing that is to strengthen the control of the party in the system, to try and damp down on the corruption, to try and damp down on the instability that more reform will bring. And on that basis, he then intends to push forward with more reforms. Now, whether he's the former, basically reactionary, or he's the latter, controlling but wants to push forward in reforms, I don't think we know yet.
Thank you. Is he a nice guy? Would you like to have a drink with him?
I've never met him. He seems to be a very nice guy. You know, the people in China say he looks like Winnie the Pooh. So he has a nickname that basically suggests Winnie the Pooh, but the Chinese censors don't like that.
Winnie the
It's
Pooh
not-
was banned.
It's not nice to make fun of your leader in China.
I know. Let me ask you a final question before we open it up. You're a defense and foreign policy and security expert, so what's happening in the South China Sea? Could that lead to a serious military conflict between the US and China, also maybe over Taiwan? As you know, there's Graham Allison's famous book, who claims that in all likelihood, he goes almost as far as that, to say that military conflict is almost, in inverted commas, inevitable. Would you agree with that?
No, I would not. Despite all the doomsaying on some quarters and some of my negative language, my remarks, I don't think that China and the United States are fated to be in conflict. I think that, in truth, when you look at the US and China today, there are very few issues that would actually precipitate serious military confrontation and escalation between the US and China. And those are the two you've mentioned, Taiwan and the South China Sea issue. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the South China Sea issue, but the South China Sea, which goes along the edge of Vietnam, right? And the Philippines on one side, Vietnam on the other, China on the north, is all of there's lots of little islands and rocks in there. There's two different island groupings, one in the north called the Paracels, and one in the south called the Spratlys. There's enormous debate over who owns the islands, rocks, atolls, submerged reefs, you name it, in this huge expanse of water. The Chinese and the Vietnamese say they own all of it in terms of the land features, The Chinese have also drawn something that's called a 9-dash line, a dashed line around the South China Sea, which they say demarcates their rights. They've never defined what those rights are. And that 9-dash line actually originated not with the Chinese communists, but with the Chinese nationalists in 1946. Chinese communists took it over. They use it in their maps to try and indicate their claims in the South China Sea, but they will not say whether or not it just means the land features and their adjoining waters, or all the waters. Why? Most people think because in China it is a hot issue of debate. And many Chinese nationalists say the 9-dash line should mean a territorial line. And everything within it is Chinese territorial waters. That would be very, very volatile. The United States wouldn't accept it, neither would any other countries. And P.S., the United Nations Law of the Sea Tribunal some years ago said that the 9-dash line basically is meaningless in legal terms. But these issues don't turn on legal interpretations. They turn on questions of power and influence. And so what you have is a continually contested area. The Chinese have built artificial islands on some of the rocks and atolls in the Spratlys, the south part. They control the north part, the Paracel Islands, and they've built these very big structures. Now, the United States says, we are going to fly and sail wherever we think we can, wherever we think we have the right to do, and they go ahead and do it. The Chinese don't like this, because the Chinese think it's provocative and they think it's a form of militarization. The United States says, we don't like what you Chinese are doing because you're building these installations on these islands and you've got missiles in there, defense missiles and things like that. That's militarization. Now, could this create a crisis? Sure. As I said in my remarks, if the Chinese decide that the United States, in fact, is increasing its presence in the South China Sea and is becoming even more in what they regard as interventionists in their disputes and discussions with the other countries that claim these places, it's not just Vietnam, there's a few others, then China could up the ante. The United States, by its own token, could up the ante as well. Put in more capabilities in the area. You could get an incident. An incident could result in loss of life. It could involve a third party. The Philippines is involved in this, right? Vietnamese are involved in this. And they could provide a role in pushing one side or the other. And you could get this, as I said in my remarks, this tendency of the Chinese to overestimate their influence and the tendency of the US to overreact. So there is a danger. Now, would it accelerate to the level of an all-out conflict? You're talking about two nuclear powers here. I doubt it very much. But it could damage the situation in the region and the relationship between the US and China in ways that it could not recover from easily. And it could propel us into a much more confrontational, more than competitive, adversarial relationship that would have impacts across the whole world. It could produce that. I don't think it would produce war. Now, Taiwan is a different matter. There, the danger of real conflict is higher. Why is it higher? Taiwan is a much bigger symbol of Chinese nationalism. And it is an island that was taken from the Chinese Empire in the latter half of the 19th century by the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War. It was seized by the Japanese as a colony and held by them until the end of the Second World War. Then it was reverted, or supposed to have reverted, back to China. Both the nationalists and the communists claim Taiwan, absolutely as part of China. But because of the Korean War, the United States stopped communist China from taking over Taiwan. And it has existed in this kind of limbo ever since, with the US committed to having no forceful resolution of the situation, but claiming that it has no stake in how it gets resolved. We have no interest in what Taiwan is as an entity. We just want the resolution to be peaceful and uncoerced. Right? So we help Taiwan sustain its defense capabilities against China. The Chinese, of course, reject this deeply, but they accept it because they have no alternative. And because an understanding about Taiwan served as the basis for normalization between the US and China. Now, what was that understanding? The One China policy. And what was that? The Chinese said, we will we will pursue the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan problem as our top priority. And that was a reversal of its previous stance, which had been the liberation, quote unquote, of Taiwan by force. The Chinese in normalization in the 70s, when the US said, we will now emphasize the peaceful resolution and we'll put it off indefinitely. And the US said, okay, we're recognizing the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China, and we don't contest the Chinese position that Taiwan is a part of China. It's not that the US government said, we recognize that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, as the Chinese say. The US simply said, we understand the Chinese position and we don't challenge it. This is the kind of ambiguity that has kept the peace, to a great extent, between the US and China now for 40 years. So if the US begins, or the Chinese begin to change that situation, the Chinese look like they're actually rejecting peaceful solutions and they think it's time for coercion. Or the United States says, our relationship with China is so dangerous now that we think Taiwan really cannot be unified with them, mainly because it's too important strategically. Therefore, we have to make sure Taiwan doesn't become reunified with China, which has never been the US position. If you get that shift on either side, you could end up in war. Because this issue is such an important issue for the legitimacy of the Chinese nation, with the leadership, that backing down is really not an option. They would, I believe, and many other colleagues believe, that the Chinese would fight even if they thought they might lose. And they might think it wouldn't escalate to nuclear war, because they think they have a higher level of commitment to the issue than the United States does. But the United States is just an island off the coast of China. So that could be a source of miscalculation. So it's a potentially dangerous situation.
Thanks for your optimism. What about Hong Kong? Will that be resolved by coercion?
No. I think the Chinese, there will have to be pushed to a high level before they would introduce military forces into Hong Kong. This is a very big issue for the Chinese, and I think they've learned some lessons from the Tiananmen incident in 1989, although I'm not sure they would have handled it differently, but who knows. The actual Secretary General of the party, the leader of the party at that time, a man named Zhao Ziyan, wanted a peaceful solution without any military intervention in that incident. And he was overruled by the elders, Deng Xiaoping in particular. Nonetheless, I think the Chinese recognize that the use of force in Hong Kong could be redefining. It could have a very paradigm-changing effect in Asia and beyond. So I think the Chinese are playing out the clock on this. They're letting this continue. They're hoping that the demonstrators will not expand in terms of their active violence, and there's a very violent minority among the protesters that gets a lot of attention. They're hoping that that violence will increasingly alienate the majority of the Hong Kong public, who, by the way, clear majority do not want to become independent from China. And they're hoping that over time, an economic approach that will increase the livelihood of the well-being of the Hong Kong residents, who are highly pressed today for a lot of reasons, that could be improved. And through that combination, you can get a more stable situation. But the Chinese government's latest actions are not terribly reassuring. They've been kind of defensive because in part they think the United States and other Western powers are manipulating the situation in Hong Kong, which I don't believe they are. But nonetheless, the Chinese are hypersensitive to this. So we still have to see how it evolves, but I would be very surprised, absent a major increase in violence in Hong Kong, that the Chinese would intervene militarily.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we haven't talked about the trade war, but we will do that perhaps in a few minutes. Let's open it up. Any questions, please? Yes, sir, this gentleman here. Do we have a microphone? There it is. And could you perhaps, that makes it easier for the camera, stand up and ask your question while standing?
Yes. Will the parity that you foresee as the best case solution require a fully rearmed and nuclear Japan?
God, I hope not. No.
No?
I don't think it would. I think it would require a Japan that is in some ways more capable and willing to provide assistance to the United States than it currently is, but in a way that reinforces this thing I talked about before, which is this defense-oriented posture, which is called a denial force posture, by the way. What I advocate is what's called a mutual denial force posture. And I think the Japanese need to play a more active role to support that sort of thing. Right now, their involvement is very, very limited to, beyond the defense of the home islands, it's limited to providing what's called rear area support for the United States in certain limited contingencies that would involve logistics support, some intelligence support, etc. I think that the Japanese would have to likely become more active in developing their capabilities in some areas, still in a defensive nature, but more than they have now. But that would still be under the limitations of the Japanese Constitution. I don't think it would require revision of the Japanese Constitution. The Japanese have what's called a no-war constitution. They actually, under their constitution, they actually have dispensed with any kind of military forces at all. But in fact, they have what's called self-defense forces. And those self-defense forces would still be the basis, but they'd have to be improved. Now, another big condition for this, though, would have to be, ultimately, some stabilization of the Korean Peninsula. Because this is, right now, the biggest real sort of monkey wrench in this situation, because you've got a North Korea that still has nuclear weapons. And I don't care what Donald Trump says, he ain't changed that dynamic in any way. He has reduced the amount of tension. I should say that not just him, but Kim has also done this. But they've done it for a series of different political reasons. It hasn't changed the basic problem. And as long as North Korea remains with nuclear weapons, both South Korea and Japan are going to remain very, very concerned. And the United States, or Trump, just talking about, well, it's basically okay as long as the North Koreans don't have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, kind of ignores the South Koreans and the Japanese, our closest allies.
Yeah.
And so we have to deal with that issue as well. Ultimately, I don't think we can stabilize the region unless we have a unified Korea without American forces on the Korean Peninsula. But that's a law.
And China would go along with that?
I think the alternative, if the alternative was a nuclearized Korean Peninsula or a nuclearized Japan, and significant numbers of American forces still on the Korean Peninsula, sure.
Thank you. Yes, there. This gentleman over there.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. In your opening comments, you were quite negative about the Trump administration's actions toward Beijing. And as you're smiling now again, I guess you agree with me. I would say they were somewhat, if I can go this far with all due respect, sarcastic and condescending. So obviously you disagree with what they're handling, how they're handling things. I would also like to, though, put it in the context that Trump has only been in office 3 years. China's rise hasn't occurred in just the 3 years. It's happened in the previous 30 years. We've had 30 years where the U.S. has been the largest enabler of China. We've facilitated economic growth, technology growth. We've allowed expansionism, as you've suggested. And I guess my question to you would be, unless we had a president like Trump right now that would put a line in the sand and say, enough is enough, we have to restore balance, the things would continue the way they were unabated. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I don't agree. And I don't agree because I don't think that the absolute categories in which you're defining this are accurate. I think U.S. policy since the normalization has not been a failure. I think the United States policy has in many respects created a dynamic within China that is continuing in the development of raising living standards and a desire to have more and more involvement in the international system. And I think that the United States has benefited from that process to a great extent. There have been costs, for sure, but I don't see where the United States would have been able to better establish a better set of policies that could have, for example, prohibited the rise of somebody like Xi Jinping in the context of the enormous upheavals that the reforms created within China. And unless you would posit that the best and only policy for the United States would be from the get-go to have pushed for a democratic China and to have on that basis sought to undermine and contain China, and that would be the best alternative to what the United States has done, unless you make that argument, I'm just not very convinced by the alternative. But I don't think the United States pushing to try and get a democratic China would have been successful. I don't think we can create, as we've seen even in countries like Iraq, we can't create democratic systems. And the Chinese system has had no history, no legacy of democratic norms. And they have a very different viewpoint in many ways about what preserves order and stability, prosperity and order in societies, in their society at least. Now that doesn't condemn them to never-ending movement politically. I think China would and should become more liberal. But it's definitely going to occur on its own conditions. And I think an effort such as the one that's being produced by the Trump administration basically undermines the ability of individuals within China who are less extreme, who are more moderate. It undermines their ability to argue for policies that could be more acceptable to the United States. Because the knee-jerk reaction of many Chinese, this was put to me very clearly by a Chinese scholar whom I respect a lot. And he said something very interesting to me. I was just in Beijing and talking with him. He said, for years, westernized scholars like ourselves and other associates whom we know are not quite so westernized, we have nonetheless looked to the United States to at times apply pressure and incentives on China and the Chinese government to become more open in various ways. And to a great extent, particularly in the economic area, that has actually worked. Not just because of US action, but the actions of other foreign countries as well. And there has been a positive result for it. However, he says, under current conditions, and this is a man, by the way, who has no deep love for the Chinese Communist Party. But he says, under current conditions, the more confrontational kind of hardline approach that the Trump administration is taking is being interpreted by many Chinese not as an effort to try to reform the Chinese government, but as an effort to weaken China. Period. It's not directed at the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in their view. It's directed at Chinese society. Because whether we like it or not, large numbers of Chinese people, they bitch and moan about the Communist Party in various ways, but they're very proud of China's accomplishments. And they're very proud of the government for having facilitated these things. And his view of this is that the United States is really now alienating a lot of people in China by making it seem as if China really wants to stunt China and not change China in the way in which he said it's been changing before. And I think that rings true for me to a great extent.
Thank you. Picking up on that question, you said yourself in your talk that some of the actions the Trump administration has taken are sensible, like probably what you mean is pointing out the lack of market access and reciprocity, intellectual property theft, things like that. So where do you think could the Trump administration improve its performance and do better than maybe being too controversial?
Well, as I said at the end of my remarks, I give a whole series of different points what I think the United States should better off be doing. It shouldn't be involved in this simplistic zero-sum, global order revisionism versus democratic order Western kind of confrontation. It should look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major initiative under the Chinese and Xi Jinping in a much more positive way. It doesn't mean it's a great success or it's necessarily going to be, but the United States has basically said, this doesn't serve our interests, it's an effort of China to take over Eurasia, and it's trying to undermine our interests, so we're going to try and oppose it, even though 100 countries have already become involved in it, including American allies. So what do you do with that? You try and force them all to withdraw? They won't. So I think you have to be able to become much more realistic about what it is that we want to achieve with the Chinese. And that doesn't mean endorsing their system. It doesn't mean endorsing what they do domestically. And God knows, what they're doing in Xinjiang now is appalling. Is everybody familiar with what's going on in Xinjiang? The Chinese basically have set up what they call re-education centers. What they are is involuntary detention camps, where they're putting up to 800,000 or more Uyghurs, ethnic minorities in northwest China, Xinjiang, through educational training. They say it's also job training and such. Maybe it is, but nonetheless, it's not voluntary, and it's a throwback. And I've told the Chinese it is damaging them incalculably internationally in their image in various ways. And they say, well, you're not under the kind of threat of terrorist attacks that we're under. Over 2,000 terrorist attacks they've had by Uyghur separatists, nationalists. I said, come on. These things are not like major losing thousands of people. These are attacks in various areas. This is a gross overreaction. So there, I think the Chinese are just mishandling the situation, but this reflects what, this more party control-oriented leadership today is doing. I lost track entirely of my original strain of argument. What was I saying?
That's okay about how the Trump administration could do better.
Xinjiang, so I was.
No, but that's a very important topic which needs to be mentioned.
Yeah, I think this sledgehammer, this approach with the terrorists, look, Trump is not going to get what he says he wants with the Chinese. The Chinese are not going to restructure their economy to satisfy the United States. What I think you're going to get is, you've already had this mini phase one agreement, which hasn't yet been settled. And what it does is it basically gives you an agreement that we could have had 2 years ago, where the Chinese agree to sell more agricultural items to the United States, and they loosen up their restrictions on foreign ventures operating in China, which they're doing now under a new joint venture law anyway. And they're going to reduce their efforts to try and coerce technology transfers, which is happening in any event. It's going down, their incidence of those things happening, because China is becoming more sophisticated, it's developing its own technology, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you're going to end up with some kind of middle ground agreement that has marginal improvements around the edges, but it's going to be nothing like the kind of transformational changes that Trump had earlier on said he wanted, and Trump will call it a big victory.
Probably. Thank you very much. Now let me get this gentleman there. Yeah.
Hi. I guess I was just wondering if this would be like an accurate description of your argument. So do you think that the current administration's view of China as a country that eventually wants to overtake the United States is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, considering that sort of the rhetoric and policies that result from that view cause the Chinese to view the United States in a more hostile manner?
Well, I think there is a certain element of that, I mean, Joseph Nye, a scholar up at Harvard, said years ago, if you treat Chinese like an enemy, then you'll have an enemy. But that is a little bit too simplistic. Internally, the Chinese have long regarded the United States as a very threatening power. I mean, they don't talk about this very publicly because they have strict controls. But they have long regarded the United States, even though they've had to deal with the United States for a variety of reasons, they've still regarded the United States with a lot of suspicion. I'm talking about within the party, senior level. And so there's always been that level of wariness. I wouldn't say hostility because it hasn't been very clearly manifested, but it's always been a kind of hesitation in a variety of areas. But there's always been this complexity to this, in my view, where you've got other individuals in the party leadership who have said, yes, but we have to be able to deal with the United States for a lot of reasons that go beyond just U.S. China relations and have to do with common objectives, et cetera, things I talked about. And I think that those arguments hold, that they do have some currency within Chinese leadership circles. So the real question, I think, is not, are we going to become strategic partners and good friends with the Chinese under their current government? No, we will not. However, can we achieve certain objectives with the Chinese through a clear understanding of our interests and theirs, and our red lines and theirs, that allow us to engage in some level of mutual accommodation while retaining deterrence in areas where we need it? Can we do this and establish a more middle ground position in which both of us can benefit without falling into the more worst case assumptions? And I think we can. And I think we have to do it by having a much clearer notion of what we want, particularly in Asia, what we're willing to settle for, and then how we're going to go about convincing our allies on this. Because the United States has long believed that prosperity and stability, particularly in Asia, but I think even worldwide, depend upon a position of the United States that is first among equals, at worst. And that's not to say, arrogance and domination and subordinate subjugation, but there's an assumption that American power and American presence is essential for stabilizing regions through our allies, and that it averts them putting money into military means and allows them to focus on economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as I said, in Asia, which is the most critical question here for strategic issues, in Asia, that situation is simply changing. And I don't think the United States wants to, or should, or has the resources to plow the kind of financial resources into staying well ahead of the Chinese in that region, I think it would be cost prohibitive, and it may not even achieve the desired objectives, because the Chinese are going to develop a very sophisticated military force no matter what. So for me, it's more a question of what's the alternative to that kind of thing. But in Washington, almost nobody questions the need to maintain the historical predominant position of the United States in the Western Pacific. Almost nobody. Because they don't want to entertain what that involves.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, really, really depressing, aren't I? But I'm not trying to, I mean,
Yes.
we're not going to be at war with the Chinese, okay?
How about a softball question? Whatever happened to Quemoy and Matsu?
We're still there.
Yeah. And what's their status? Is that part of the Taiwan?
Yeah, they're still under Taiwan control. I mean, we used to have, the Chinese, the mainland Chinese and the Taiwanese used to have this exchange of artillery fire because they wanted to show that they were still at war with each other and they weren't compromising with each other. That has disappeared. And so, and you have U.S. forces that are in those, not U.S., pardon me, you have Taiwan forces there, which are kind of like symbolic. They don't mean anything any longer. In the past, way back in the past, the 40s and 50s, Chiang Kai-shek, the old leader of Taiwan, thought that he'd use those islands as a stepping point to retake the mainland. Of course, all that's gone.
Thank you. Question over there?
My understanding, which may or may not be correct, is that what keeps the Chinese leadership up late at night has less to do with military confrontation on their borders than it has to do with internal insurrection. And towards the amelioration of that problem, they have engaged, as I think we all see and read, in vast infrastructure investments. We've heard of the empty cities. I've seen the tall empty buildings. And I read about a year ago in a major national magazine an article written by an economist who said basically the investment, the borrowing the money to invest in those non-productive infrastructure projects was going to hit a wall at some point. Is that a serious concern in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about hit a wall in the sense of, the collapse of the Chinese economy and a rapid decline. Some people predict that. I mean, there's a guy named Gordon Chang, some of you may know about, who talks about this quite a lot, and he wrote a book back in the early 2000s predicting China would collapse in 2006. He keeps on saying it over and over again. As I tell him, someday, Gordon, you'll be right. I think that I agree with the Chinese. If you had to look at a sort of level of prioritizations for the Chinese leadership, their first priority, first and foremost, is their domestic environment. Now, what that means and what that entails is then a question of some debate. I don't think that the Chinese leadership sits on top of a huge mass of Chinese people yearning to be free. I think it's much more complex than that. And I think the Chinese government, they want to be able to provide enough positive development for China, for the Chinese people. And Xi Jinping, in fact, has said this is our primary objective now, is raising people's standard of living and livelihood, and not just becoming a great power. I think that how to do that, how best to do that and keep themselves still in power is their challenge, which doesn't mean there's somebody waiting in the wings to overthrow them. But it means, as I said before, what is the basis of their legitimacy and what would continue to sustain basic unity and stability within leadership. Dealing with these these loan issues, which is what you're referring to, with the empty apartments and such, is part of this. The Chinese are trying to deleverage a huge amount of local government debt that has accumulated during the reform period. Because China does not have an open, free market global financial system. Banks are, to some degree, political. They will lend money and sustain and prop up enterprises if it's important to keep them going, as opposed to throwing people out on the street. And there could be large numbers of people doing that. So they have to strike that balance between some level of intervention and some level of letting these things respond to free market forces. And they've just recently now, I was just telling Klaus, started an effort to try and have more market-based standards for bankruptcies. Because under the declining growth rate in China now, more and more Chinese enterprises are going bankrupt. In the past, whether or not they could go bankrupt and the kind of assistance they may or may not get was often a political question, if we're talking about bigger enterprises. And so you would get intervention to prop up companies. Now the Chinese are trying to actually let them fail because of market forces in order to be able to have those market forces become more relevant to the economy and send signals. Now this relates to the issue I said before. Is Xi Jinping a reformer or isn't he? And we will have to see how far this goes in the future. He's trying to balance two things, right? Party control and intervention, etc., with free market incentive, etc., that can provide more efficiency and globalization and all of that. And it's a very delicate balancing act.
But are the increasing repression measures which have occurred for the last few years, the security cameras everywhere, banning of internet sources, ever more Western newspapers, for example, are banned, is it not a sign of insecurity and a belief that there might be something around the corner, something like social unrest? How would you otherwise explain these measures?
Well, I think it is clearly a reflection of the fact that a man like Xi Jinping and the senior levels of communist leadership do not believe that China can remain stable in an open information society. That in part, they believe that, I think in part because of the very, very sort of divisive nature of many aspects of Chinese society. I mean, China is a very complex place, has a lot of different interests across the country, and a lot of different people and groups and organizations moving in somewhat different directions. It's always astounded me that China, given Chinese culture, Chinese history and such, that China could actually claim to be a socialist country. Because they're so non-socialistic in the way that I think many Chinese people behave. And so I think they have a fear that these forces could become uncontrollable within China. I mean, they're highly entrepreneurial, highly energetic, but they could also become very, very, destabilizing. So their reaction is what they know best, which is limit information. And how much to limit it is always a question. Limit information, limit the level of dialogue, particularly when you're talking about the government's authority and position. And then improve the degree of ability to oversee Chinese society at levels that we would not tolerate in this country. I was just in Beijing, and I said, the first time I went to China was in the early 1980s. And, I mean, seeing the evolution of China over that period of time has been breathtaking. But one thing that the Chinese have always impressed me is that when it comes to things like jaywalking, they're unbelievable. And they would and driving cars, and it just wouldn't matter what the rules were. All that's gone now. You're standing at a light, and there's no traffic in either direction. And I'm standing there next to a Chinese guy, and we're looking at the light, and it says red, don't walk. And I said, you're not going across the road, are you? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, you see that camera over there? If I jaywalk, this actually wasn't told me by him, but it told me by a friend of mine who's lived in China for 25 years. If you jaywalk in China, they have face recognition. In 2 minutes, they take money out of your bank account.
So foreigners are in a good position without a Chinese bank account. We can do the jaywalking. Great.
So you see, there are elements. Some Chinese will look at this and say, great, going to control criminals, going to create more social order. Yes, it's government interference, but we're going to put up with it. Other Chinese will say, this is baloney. This is ridiculous. This is way too interventionist. But it's just, I mean, we in the West would just react to it like, forget it. But in China, it's not so easy.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay,
That's a microphone.
that girl in the right there. Thank you for your talk, Doctor. I'm curious, what I know of North Korea depends on China for a lot of their economic well-being. How much real influence does China have on North Korea?
No one knows. And if people say they do know, they're lying. I think that the Chinese look at North Korea as this really irritating, upstart country that doesn't listen to their advice and does all kinds of stupid things. But they feel they have to support this country because of the history of their relationship with this country, which goes right back to the Korean War, and because, to a certain extent, the country serves as a buffer against the U.S. presence in the Korean Peninsula and the possibility of the United States being influential in a unified Korea. So they put up with a lot of North Korean behavior. They certainly don't like what the North Koreans have been doing lately in terms of the nuclear program, although they're much more receptive now to the idea of giving the North Koreans a break that is easy enough on sanctions to give them more security assurances to then encourage them to gradually denuclearize. I think that ultimately that will not be successful, but we haven't even begun to go down that path in a meaningful way, I don't think. Certainly not in this administration.
Thank you. There was a lady in red.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. And I'm a Chinese international student here in the United States. I also know that there are more than 300,000 Chinese international students here in the United States. Can you comment a little bit on this population and how do you think this population should move forward? Or like,
well, actually this has become a very salient issue because I don't know how closely you all follow this, but the director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, has made the statement that China represents an all-of-society threat to the United States. And he has said that many, many Chinese students, Chinese researchers, Chinese scholars in the United States are acting on behalf of the PRC government. And they are engaging in espionage in a variety of different ways, and we have to deal with it more effectively. Now, I think that it is without question true that there are Chinese students, researchers, and scholars in the United States who are engaging in espionage. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Now, do I think that the best way to handle that is to adopt methods in which virtually every Chinese scholar and student in a high-tech area is suspected of being a potential spy unless proven otherwise? I think that that approach is becoming excessive. It's not, I don't know what the right phrase is, it's not really reflective of the reality of the situation. We've had incidences now where the FBI has taken aside Chinese scholars, some of whom who have been very vocal in being very positive on U.S. China relations. And they have said to them, we want you to tell us who you have contacts with in the Chinese government. And we want you to also give us information on other Chinese scholars. And if you don't do this, we will take away your visa. And that has happened. And so, I think that the threat is there, the concern is there. I think the scale of it has yet to be demonstrated. And I think this is true of the overall argument about Chinese influence operations in the United States. I think the scale of it, the scope of it, the severity of it have yet to be proven. And when you approach U.S. officials about this, they'll just say, oh, it's classified, we can't talk about this. And that, to me, that's not a good enough answer. Because it doesn't serve well to justify the kind of direction in which we're moving now on this issue. We have to have a better way of dealing with this than the kind of sledgehammer approach that seems to be favored so far. And I don't have an easy answer to it. I think having Chinese students in the United States is extremely good. I think it's, on balance, very positive. I think the Chinese government should allow more American students to go to China. And there should be a greater degree of freedom of American and Western students in China than, in fact, has been the case. The Chinese government, for years, has themselves used visas to make statements about foreign scholars. If you're too anti-China, they will deny you a visa. If you're what they regard as friendly to China, quote unquote, they'll give you a better visa. So, I mean, they engage in this game as well. But we can do better than that.
Thank you. What has been the image, if you know, of the Chinese people, of particularly Chinese students of the United States since the trade war erupted? Has the current conflict influenced that image of the Chinese and of the United States?
We should ask this young lady who's a Chinese student what she thinks the trade war, what the image is among her friends, her Chinese friends, about the United States. What do you think?
Me? Okay.
Hold on, the microphone is coming.
All right. I got to admit a very sad truth. Is that when I came here like about 7 years ago, I actually had my undergraduate education in Hong Kong, although I have my high school education back in mainland China. So before I come to the U.S., I really think this is the place I want to live, and this is the place that I can get my scientific training done better than if I were stay in Hong Kong or go back to mainland China. And I should be able to accomplish my dream, being a middle class or even higher person in the future. However, now I think my better chance of achieving that maybe is going back to China, because I think I can play a much better role back in China because there is no visa restriction and no discrimination against the internationals. So that's my personal perspective. I don't know how this holds across my friends though, but I believe a majority of them are considering that, because last year, or the year before, I don't remember the exact, but 80% of the Chinese international students decided to go back to China. So.
Thank you.
I mean, it's partly because there are a lot of opportunities in China now. Years ago, there weren't. So many Chinese students came here and they thought they were going to get educated and they're going to stay here. Now, despite all this, China's senior leadership, to a great extent, sends their children to the West to be educated. They still do it. There's something about being educated in the West that still is very attractive to them, clearly. But I think what the young lady is saying is also true, that there is a growing sense among many Chinese students here that the U.S. is just becoming a much less welcome place for them. And that's, I think, really sad. And I don't think it serves our interests to have that happen.
Would you say it's because of our political climate at the moment with our president?
I wouldn't, in this case, I wouldn't say this is Donald Trump. I would say there is a general sense. If you listen to members of Congress talking about China today, they don't sound much different from anybody in the Trump administration, Democrat or Republican. I mean, they will say, Marco Rubio is unbelievable. I mean, they will say things about, the threat posed by China that is really, really pretty extreme. And so I think there's a general consensus in Washington, although it's not, as I said, 100%, that regards China as a very serious, near existential threat to the United States that has to be countered with some very extreme measures.
Yeah, Schumer also is a very critical position.
Democrat.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. We have time for a couple of more questions, this gentleman here. And then it would be nice if we have some more ladies asking a question too.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. So the issue with suspicion around espionage for students and researchers kind of speaks to the broader issue of the lack of trust and the history of lack of trust in the relationship between U.S. and China. So to point back to your prescription of an open and upfront relationship that acknowledges where our interests differ, but also pushes to cooperate on the areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate at a higher level. I think in a practical sense, that lack of trust that exists and has existed between the U.S. and China will be a large barrier to that. So how do you think from a government-to-government relationship that lack of trust can be overcome to cooperate in the way that you prescribed?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. I don't have any silver bullet answer to this. I think it requires, as I said in my comments, it requires leaders to recognize that both sides are going to have to undertake initiatives that are credible and are seen as, in some sense, for themselves, costly, but are used as a way of trying to create a greater sense of confidence in the relationship. I don't want to say, well, trust is to some degree, but some people say you don't need trust to have good relationships. You just need to recognize what your interests are, and then just have an agreement that reflects those interests. But I think that when you're talking about, if you're trying to avoid being in a kind of peaceful coexistence, Cold War type of environment, and I hope we don't end up in that kind of situation, that you do have to have a certain level of trust, but you can't have it unless there are certain areas where the two sides are able to really accommodate each other in ways that could be perceived as costly. Now, what would they be? I think some of them are economic. I think some of them are in the military security area, but they have to be based on a sense of reciprocity. I argued a very unpopular position in Washington about the American freedom of navigation operations, which we conduct. We conduct these operations with everybody, by the way. We conduct them with U.S. allies. But U.S. allies don't care because they're not scared of us. They're not concerned about us. But these operations, I think, can be modulated as a confidence-building measure in order to achieve certain objectives on the Chinese side in limiting their militarization. And if you really were willing to make those kinds of understandings and give it a go and try and see if they would really stabilize, then you could see, in fact, do the two sides really commit themselves to a stable environment? Is that what they want? Or are they just basically having a temporary truce and they're going to cheat? And then you're going to see them moving towards a more confrontational stance. So I think you have to be able to be willing to make those kinds of gestures and actions, even though you may not have them succeed in the way in which you'd like, but you still want to see if the other side is going to reciprocate. But you have to sit down and work out what those things might be, and that really requires an understanding about where your bottom line is. And for the United States, something like freedom of navigation is such a basic principle to the U.S. Navy that it's sort of like we make these decisions as a government and nobody else tells us how we can do it, and we'll go ahead and do it. As long as it's within the parameters of international laws, we see it. But I'm saying that, in certain of these instances, in these areas that are really super sensitive, there's possibility of compromising on this issue in order to get something from the other side.
Thank you. In your talk, you skipped Russia. There's a new realignment between China and Russia. Will it last?
I think it will last as long as we don't correct our relationship with the Chinese. It will get even more so, because I think the American policy line, both regarding Russia and China, and I'm not trying to in any way excuse their behavior, but I think the U.S. position has served to strengthen the Sino-Russian relationship in ways that would not have otherwise occurred. And if we can get a more reasonable, balanced China policy, I think that the incentives to have that happen will go down, because the Russians and the Chinese are not natural strategic allies.
Thank you very much. We have time for one final question over there. We waited strategically for having that opportunity right at the end.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Swain. I just have one question. So when do you anticipate the China-US relationship will be improved? Do you think in 5 years or even getting worse? Yeah, thank you.
Be optimistic.
Can I ask you a question? Are you from China, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. This is, I ask because I get this kind of question in Washington. Somebody from China will come in and they'll say, now, when exactly is the United States and China relationship going to become this? Will it be 2 years? Will it be 3 years? Will it be 4 years? It's like, you want some kind of a measurement of it. I think that we could very well have to have this relationship get worse before it gets better. Because the costs of the current line, and I'm not talking just about the United States here, the costs of the current approach are not yet fully manifest, in my opinion. And they could very well be manifest in a crisis. But to me, that's a very dangerous way to try and correct the situation, because it's as likely to go in the wrong direction, as I said earlier, and make it much worse if it's not handled. There have been crises in the past between the U.S. and China that have actually clarified people's thinking and made them pull back and engage in more determined efforts to try to reach some kind of understanding. The EP3 incident, when the United States accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy back in 1997, 98, is one case of that. So it's, pardon me, that was the EP3. The EP3 incident was an aircraft, where the aircraft and the Chinese aircraft had a collision. And the Chinese aircraft went down and the US aircraft force landed on Hainan Island. The other one was when we bombed the embassy, the Chinese embassy. So I think it's dangerous to rely on that sort of thing. I would not hazard a guess. I think a democratic administration would be potentially, I think it would be more coherent in terms of its policy initiatives towards China. It would be more, in some ways it could be more effective in addressing some of the really serious concerns that we have with the Chinese. And on that basis, there might be a greater level of clarity that would be possible to sort of stabilize the relationship, put a platform underneath it. But it's just really hard to say at this point. I do think that things probably, given the sentiments that are in Washington on both sides of the aisle, and given what's going on under Xi Jinping, who has not yet really pushed forward with another phase of reforms and who has this strong emphasis on his position and the ideology and the party role, that we're not going to see a change in this situation anytime soon.
This is not the optimistic answer we wanted to hear. But thank you very much for coming here. Very insightful, very educational, and we learned a lot. I think all of us did. Next week, please, we have the next event already on November the 14th, and this time we will talk about Putin's gamble and what is going on, not in China, but in Russia, and Russia's relations with China and the West. Please come again next week already, Thursday, November 14, in this very room at 5:30 p.m. Celeste Wallander is the speaker. And have a good evening.